This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. Research shows veterans suffer from chronic pain twice that of the general population, and chronic pain can have an impact on quality of life. What are some things people can do to help with chronic pain? Mindfulness has been shown to have some positive outcomes for health. However, can mindfulness also help with pain? Today, I'm joined by Dr. Rahul Gupta, who is a medical doctor, certified mindfulness teacher, and a somatic experience practitioner. Rahul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Tom. Yeah, really pleased to be here.
Maybe you can start us off by telling us what is mindfulness.
Sure. Yeah, it's really can be a broad question because there's many different people that might define it in other ways. I might go back to how I trained and the definition that I found most useful, where we could think of mindfulness as kind of three components. One being on purpose, like in essence, choosing deliberately. That's the first component. The second component is to be in the present moment. And that's not easy because if you're anything like me, you will have seen how our mind likes to go into the past and likes to go into the future. And it actually has a hard time to be here. And it's especially hard in our kind of current society where there's so many distractions. And then the third element is with wholeheartedness, or in other words, suspending our judgments. And that's also really hard because, some good evidence to show that we can stay in a curious mindset for probably less than 3 seconds. We're continually making judgments. And so whether we realize it or not, our unconscious mind and body are judging situations as safe, unsafe, good, bad, right, wrong. And with mindfulness practice, what we're trying to do really is to purposely interrupt kind of that habituated response that we have, do our best to really be here, and do it with attitudes of wholeheartedness, where we bring curiosity, we bring patience, we do our best to not try to get anywhere. And it's quite radical because we live in a society that actually has a very different kind of orientation, where we're always trying to get somewhere. We've got a sense of urgency. And as the problems ramp up, we tend to try to go faster. And with mindfulness, really, it's this idea of, okay, can we recognize that things are urgent? Can we slow down to actually take in what's happening with more accuracy? Because the attitudes are all about kind of open-heartedness, some might call it mind-heartfulness, because it's both a kind of accessing our mind and our thoughts and what's going on for us on a cognitive lens, but it's especially bringing in our heart in terms of how we orient our attitude to this moment. So I find that actually a really helpful piece, that this is not actually just working with thoughts, but actually our emotions as well as a critical part of this.
And I guess I was just talking to somebody before we started this podcast about, the effects of social media and the distractions that cause it in life. So this obviously could help. But so when you talk about those three purposes for mindfulness, how does that translate into helping with health?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, what I would say is that, there's a lot of unconscious forces that are operating within us. And whether we realize it or not, we're always scanning our environment to assess for whether it's safe or dangerous or even life-threatening. And if our system senses that we're under some sort of threat, we'll go into a defensive posture. And that kicks in all these things happening within our system that will get us into a fight response, a flight response, or even a freeze response. And that has real implications for what happens in our body, because our blood pressure goes up, our breathing changes, it changes the blood flow to our gut, it changes how our immune function occurs, it changes even what we perceive with our eyes and ears. There's all these shifts that are happening based on our perception of threat. And so if we've had all these unconscious forces that are kind of shaping how we view the world, we are often then perceiving threat even at times when we don't have threat, because we can imagine it if we're thinking back to the past, or if we're anticipating future threats. We can actually be giving our system these signals that get our system on kind of high alert. And then if this is happening over time, not a big surprise, depending on our predispositions genetically, we might end up with high blood pressure. We might end up with, high blood sugars that lead to diabetes. We might end up with immune challenges that lead to, more susceptibility to infections or even cancer cells. we might end up with a ton of chronic pain, as we're maybe going to get into, because our system has been geared ready for a fight or flight kind of response, but doesn't have anywhere to use or put that energy. And so it has massive implications for our well being physically and also psychologically. And the research is really clear on that. There are thousands and thousands of studies there that are demonstrating how mindfulness can be kind of a way of moving forward trans diagnostically, which is a term I like, which is saying it can be helpful across the board because the systems that it's influencing affect all of our bodily function. And any disease states, including our mind, are going to be influenced by this underlying physiology that mindfulness can intervene and support.
Because the release of cortisol is one of the responses to stress, is it not?
Yeah, like, I mean, there's kind of both the catecholamines, like the noradrenaline and adrenaline, that gets released when we get into fight or flight. And then yes, there's also a cortisol response, which is trying to like almost stabilize some of that fight or flight response. So, in a healthy situation, we have some sort of threat, we have a fight or flight response, and then the system settles again. And we might not get much of a rise in cortisol level in that situation. But if it's chronic, if we're getting these activations of our blood pressure and other things that are actually bringing up our adrenaline, then we're going to have rise in cortisol levels too, almost as a way to try to dampen what our system is doing. And if that's happening over long periods of time, that's suppressing our immune system. It's driving our blood pressure even further up. It's even shrinking parts of our brain that are involved with memory and concentration.
Hmm. And then does it impact things like inflammation as well?
Absolutely. Right. So we will actually have both happening because, if our system is sensing there's a threat, yeah, that's kind of an inflammatory response that's kind of coming into our system. We actually see changes in even what blood cells are going to be doing, kind of getting ready to gear us up to deal with some sort of defense. And at the same time, cortisol is actually going to dampen that immune response. So we're having both issues coming up, both that we can inflame our systems and we might not even be fighting it super well because our cortisol levels aren't going to be as robust. Over time, they start to lose a little bit of their capacity to respond effectively to, what we might need to buffer our system.
So when we talk about, these responses that the body has, so what I hear you saying is mindfulness by slowing down reduces that, or what would be a good way to explain how the mindfulness helps?
Yeah, how mindfulness can help, because mindfulness is kind of two things. It's both a technique and it's a way of being. So as a technique, it can help because if we slow down, we can actually sense what's happening in our system. We can sense, oh wow, have I fallen into some defense mode? Have I started to, have a physiology of needing to escape a situation? Am I engaged in kind of a fight response? Or have I checked out from a kind of overwhelmed state of kind of the freeze response? And so with mindfulness practice, we can kind of just take a bit of a step back and sense what's actually happening. And it's a way of being because we have this knee jerk reflex to turn away from discomfort. So, all the things I just mentioned, part of us doesn't want to notice these things because it can be overwhelming. It can be difficult for our system to even take in that information. So, mindfulness as a way of being gives us the attitudes that help us have the courage to turn towards those things that are actually happening right now. And by turning towards them, we have much more choice. We can say, oh, wow, my system is exhausted right now. Maybe the last thing I need right now is to say yes to another job opportunity or another request to do something. Or maybe I could notice, wow, my system is jacked up. Maybe what I need right now is a kind of healthy way to discharge some of that energy. Maybe I need to go for a brisk walk, or maybe I need to get into you know, the bath to kind of settle my system. So we have this opportunity to sense what's going on with our kind of nervous system physiology and therefore respond with a lot more wisdom and compassion. That's a big part of this practice is having compassion for ourselves. I guess the other piece I would say about how mindfulness practice can be really helpful because it's not just a practice for kind of regulating our nervous system, it's also a practice to support us to understand deeper realities.
Hmm.
As an example, the fact that everything's changing. So when we slow down and we can notice, wow, my thoughts are changing, my emotions are changing, my body's changing. it can help me kind of maybe not be quite so identified with my experiences that can then, tend to bring on some resistance and tend to even further add fuel to the fire. And in that sense, mindfulness practice can really also support us to see how not just that everything's kind of impermanent, but that we're also very deeply connected. So it can help us actually start to find community. And that's maybe a piece I would say about this is that if anything I've learned the most about this practice, it's not a practice to do alone. I think apps are great and I think they can be having some value, but I really think where this practice comes alive is in community because that's the place where we start to feel more safe. Most of this kind of defense physiology is coming up because in relationship we've experienced some lack of safety. And when we start to do this practice with other people, we actually create the conditions where our system starts to settle and starts to actually have the experience of safety with other people, which can have profound implications on, our physiology over time.
And when you talk about the nervous system, I mean, with chronic pain, we've heard other people on the show talk about, centralization of the nervous system. And if it's jacked up, it can affect pain. So what you're saying is if we stop and just kind of ground ourselves and understand our body, we can tame it. We can calm that nervous system, but also understand what's jacking it up. And I mean, we look at a lot of veterans who struggle with identity and transition leaving the service. That would be something potentially that could, as they're transitioning, jack up their nervous system. But if they understood that and were aware, what I'm hearing you say is that can actually calm it down a little bit as well too.
Right. It can, and it may not be immediate. Right. So sometimes actually as we turn towards it, we might notice, wow, I'm really jacked up and that's uncomfortable. And our go-to strategy would be to avoid it and try to look elsewhere and to try to move away from it. So sometimes people can try to practice and initially they'll be like, oh, this practice doesn't work for me. It actually makes me feel worse. But actually, if we can slow it down enough and titrate it, do it in small amounts, like just kind of check in to whatever degree we can comfortably do, yes, it can absolutely start to settle the system. I'll sometimes use the analogy of like a champagne bottle. And if it's just being shaken and shaken and shaken with no kind of release to the system, well, at some point it's going to explode for sure. And if we try to take any pressure off, again, it's just going to be quite ugly. However, if we learn how to slowly release some of that pressure and do it in a kind of titrated way, we can start to slowly let the system settle itself, find balance again, and it doesn't have to be so difficult or painful. And then gradually at some point we get to a place where, okay, now there's, a manageable amount and it doesn't have the kind of intensity that it otherwise might.
So I guess that's where the community comes into play, is that support and understanding of what one's going through, right? I guess.
Yeah, right. Because the other piece of this is, any person who's gone through pain, and as we're talking about pain, it's both physical pain and emotional pain. We know pretty clearly that our brain really can't tell the difference between social rejection and, a physical disc herniation. Our brain is going to kind of perceive them as both a form of threat, and the same parts of our brain light up. So yes, if we can be in community with people, one that can help slow things down, but also to help us just realize that everybody suffers. We all suffer in our own way. That's the nature of being human, is that we're constantly changing. We're constantly going through loss and difficulty, challenge, aging, separations, illnesses. And so once we start to sense, oh wow, this isn't necessarily personal. This is actually something that's just innate to being human. That takes away some of the pain of feeling like we've been singled out.
Hmm.
And it helps us kind of sense that, oh wow, I'm not the only one. And then other people actually are finding their own way forward. So we can get inspired by other people's stories. And there's something very powerful about exploring these ideas and techniques and ways of being in community.
And that kind of takes me back, I think, to our veteran heli hike we did this past summer for chronic pain, where a group of people came together after months of education, and there was a sense of community, but also some started to have a sense of awareness of just things would just come out, because they are together, you are talking, you're in a nature setting, and taking some of the education they had over the years, and so that's what it's sounding like. So community is important, but if someone's by themselves in a rural area, We have many people that live in that are not a community. What can they do if they're saying, okay, I'm interested in mindfulness, I'd like to try it? Where do they start? How do they begin that journey?
Yeah, well, two things you've said I maybe want to highlight. So, because you said about, the power of nature. And so I think that's a really important insight because when I say community, we can kind of restrict that just to human beings. But wow, that's not in fact the case. We know that there's like electromagnetic fields in the natural world around us that are continually available. And we forget that we've co-evolved with all of the other species around us. And there's a lot of good evidence around kind of the healing power of just being in the natural world. So I love your story about how when people come together in a natural setting, how that can be supportive. So yes, for somebody who's, for instance, in a rural setting, kind of expanding their sense of what supported community might look like to include, getting into nearby forests or getting onto the water and sensing your connection. Mindfulness practice can actually help us start to see how we're not that separate from all of these other beings. We share oxygen with so many different species across the planet, and water is vital for our existence. So we can connect with a lot of these other experiences that I think can be supportive. And then also, if it is with human beings, that is one of the beauties of technology. I've found myself that community can happen very much online. And so I do encourage people to actually seek out different practices that are out there. There are a lot of different places where mindfulness communities are being offered. And if possible, I would encourage people to just check out ones that are in their community. They sometimes can be surprised who in their community might actually be ready to participate.
And I like how you talk about the evidence to support that, because I read a research article out of Washington State where they use veterans in the Alpine to help with both psychological and some chronic pain, to just the power of healing in nature. There is evidence, like you say, and it's, I think, having been through it myself, being out with the guys and girls hiking, you can see that there's some power there. So as we get close to the end here, what are some tips the audience could take away for mindfulness? What do you think would be some top tips?
I'm thinking of your audience, that might be dealing with a lot of physical and emotional pain, if what I'm hearing, how you're framing things. I guess the first thing I would say is, just start from wherever you are. It can feel like we have to get to a certain place before we begin. And that's not been my experience. My experience, really from a mindfulness perspective, is that whatever is in front of us, whatever this day brings, it's here, and it's kind of our own curriculum for life. So can we find a way to be in relationship with it? I'm dealing with right now a dental issue that I've had for 6 weeks, and nobody's been able to quite figure out what's going on. So I've been living with on and off fairly significant pain in my mouth that is here, and part of me wants to be like, oh wow, I would love to just ignore this, have somebody rip it out, just take care of the issue. And yet the reality is, there's pains we're all going to experience that don't have immediate solutions. So every day it's actually a great teacher for me, because it's supporting me to notice, okay, wow, well, where do I have some power here, and can I get out of this need to like meet the whole experience with tension? And so I'm just constantly just letting my shoulders relax, letting my hands come out of the fists that they might get into. I watch the thoughts that might come up, like, oh my God, this is going to, end up with a massive infection that's going to then, have me in the ICU. I can watch those thoughts and go, wow, okay, that's not what's happening. And I can reassure myself with kinder thoughts, with more patience. And so I guess that's a kind of a long way of saying we can really just explore this idea of meeting our moments with kindness as a starting place. And if we can even find one other person who's even just one step further on the journey to be with us and support us, that can be a wonderful starting place.
Because I guess we all rehearse in our mind. We all have bad thoughts. I shouldn't say all, but most people I've met are like that, right? We all go through that process. So what I hear you saying is to slow down, recognize that, be aware of that, challenge it,
Yeah.
and have compassion.
Yeah. In fact, I love how you said that, because you're reminding, maybe I'll just end with this, the stop technique. So the stop, the S is to stop and pause and see if we can interrupt that kind of autopilot, and the T is to take a couple of breaths, which is a way of just telling our system right now things are safe enough for us just to pause. And then the O is to observe, just to notice what's in our system, our thoughts, our emotions, our physical sensations, to whatever we can tolerate. And yes, the P is to proceed with compassion, just inviting a little bit of kindness. And we've got some wisdom about some more details and seeing if we can just afford ourselves a little bit of friendly, hospitable choice that might give us a different experience.
And all that calms our system down, calms the reactions down, and brings our blood pressure down and inflammation and etc.
Yeah, over time. And above all, gives us choice, and helps us see the nature of our beings in a way that hopefully does really serve us, not just as individuals, but as a species.
Great. Well, thank you, Rahul. That was very informative. I think helpful. I learned a lot. So thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
To our audience, thanks for listening. And if you have any feedback about the show or you want more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain COE and on Instagram, chronicpain_COE. Thanks again, and everybody stay safe and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network and Eye Contact Productions.